Hi, it's John Kelly. In this module, we are going to discuss control testing. And as always, we want to be efficient and effective, follow professional standards, and document what we have done properly. Now, in particular, I'm going to talk about control testing of details and its value, efficiency, and effectiveness. And to do this, I'm going to use the example of a client of mine. It was a large distributor, and they occasionally paid cash for returns. Most returns were just for credit to account, but occasionally cash was given. And there was a form that had to be initialed if cash was given. So I promptly decided to plan my audit by selecting 20 forms that had a cash refund and checked to see whether the initials were there. Now that's a classic control test of details, and it's also classically time-consuming and boring, but I didn't think about that at the time. And of course, the first problem and the first issue is I started planning testing without reference to risk of material misstatement. I presumed that there was some risk of material misstatement, that the financial statements were somehow wrong because either, I guess, cash had been given out and no merchandise had been received, or merchandise was received and cash was given and then the merchandise was stolen before it got to the warehouse. So I didn't think about that. I just started testing. So that's the first thing that was wrong. Second thing that was wrong was hadn't done any risk assessment procedures. I hadn't bothered to find out whether or not, in fact, this could be wrong. So I hadn't done anything, hadn't looked at the client's records, hadn't considered anything, talked to anyone, had done nothing to determine whether or not this was a risk. And the second thing, if you think about it, how could the financial statements be materially misstated? Because if someone steals the cash and records the inventory going back into inventory, either the bank rec is going to be short or the inventory is going to be short. And if they take cash to themselves and say that they've put goods back into inventory, then the inventory is going to be short, and inventory was counted and adjusted at year end. So even if people had stolen stuff, the financial statements could not have been materially misstated because the bank was reconciled at year end and inventory was counted and adjusted at year end. So if there had been theft, it would have been eliminated. The effect of it would have been eliminated, and the financial statements at year end would have been correct. The third issue is, if the form is signed, we assume that that means that everything's okay. And it could be that somebody just signed the form, whether or not they did it right. The opposite is, and we assume if the form is not signed, we assume that there is an error, but it could be that someone just forgot to sign the form and everything's fine. The form's not signed. So there's a real risk of wasted time here, even if there is no problem. We may find a bunch of forms that are not signed, but in the end, there's no problem. All the inventory that's supposed to be there is there. So, of course, we did the test. We looked at 20 items, and it came back that 4 were not signed. And 4 in 20 is just too many to be able to say that you're using the control. The other interesting thing was that of 2 forms that were issued during a strike when management was taking over, both weren't signed. And the other 2 were at other times. So we were forced to assume failure of the test and either extend our test or do something else. Now, issues 4 and 5, if we did the test right and we tested 20, one would presume that if we test 20 more, we're going to find exactly the same thing, so extending the test is pointless. The other thing that we should assume is, if 2 out of 2 during the strike were not approved, I think we should take that as an indication that during the strike, when management was taking over, the control didn't operate. So we have to believe those 2 results. Now, my first response was I wished I'd never ever done the test because it took a couple of hours to do it and document it, and it didn't work. And I was reluctant to have staff go ahead and do more. And I said, please just go back down to that department and take a quick look and just quickly riffle through the forms and tell me what's going to happen if we do in fact take the time to document and do another 20 like in an organized way. And sure enough, during the strike, none were approved, and sure enough, lots were initialed. My staff person actually said, it's probably more than 2 out of the 18 not during the strike. There are lots that aren't initialed. The control just seems to not be working. So I decided that more control testing was probably pointless. The test I decided was probably badly conceived from the beginning, and I decided I would do something else. And what I did was I looked around and found a report on warehouse shortages. And I found that less than $1,000 a year on millions and millions, tens and twenties of millions of dollars worth of inventory had gone missing during the year. And that could be explained easily by breakage and stuff like that. Now, that was in fact a risk assessment procedure. And I should have done that at the beginning. I should have said, is this going to be a problem? Done that risk assessment procedure and said, there is no risk of material misstatement. I don't need to do any testing. And the other thing, of course, is despite the fact that the control appeared not to work, in fact, it had worked, and there was no misstatement in the financial statements. Even though people weren't initialing things, they were, in fact, properly issuing refunds and properly returning inventory to the warehouse. So issue number 6 is then, is detailed control testing a really good audit strategy? Is it a good idea? And the answer is maybe not, because control tests often fail even when things are okay, as in this example. The other thing is research on control testing shows that staff often miss deviations, and that questions the worth of control testing. So issue number 7 is there is non-sampling risk in control testing. Now the research done, this was done at a university, and they canvassed a bunch of the big CA firms in their town, said please send us your very best staff, and they created a real documentation package with deviations in it, and then sat the staff down and said, we're trying to see how well you will find the deviations that are in this sample, and please go look for them. And the research result was that still way too many were missed. It was in the range of 2 out of 20, which is too many. Now the research conclusion was, well, we should try really, really much harder when we do control testing. And my observation is, I don't think in the real world you could do any better than that. And as a matter of fact, they were doing really, really well and really, really emphasizing that people should look for control testing. So my conclusion would be, in the real world, we're going to miss even more because people were trying really hard to find these deviations, and they were really good staff. They were the best staff. The other issue is the value of initials. And really, all initials on a form means that there are initials on the form. It could be wrong even though it was initialed. The person could do it wrong and initial it anyway. So the presence of initials does not mean that it's right, and the absence of initials does not mean that it's wrong, but it sure makes for a pretty test, and it makes for pretty documentation, and we've got a whole page in the working papers, and we find 20 initials. We're lucky, it works. But it's really a poor reason to do it, because it's really probably not a terribly effective test. So the conclusions, the positive ones at least, are before you do any testing, think of risk of material misstatement. Like, what could be wrong? Could anything be wrong? Because we're doing testing in response to risk of material misstatement. And the second is, and actually maybe this should be the first, you should do risk assessment procedures. You should do risk assessment procedures to be able to identify where you think there might be a risk of material misstatement in the financial statements, and then to the extent that you conclude that there is, you do testing. Now, a couple of other sort of side observations on this. If we are using a client-prepared document, for instance, I was using the inventory shortage report, you need to do some kind of testing of that, and for instance, a systems walkthrough, one transaction, could be enough. So if you want to say, I've used a client-prepared document and I've done something to give me some level of confidence that it's right, Your systems walkthrough could do that. So that's a really good argument for doing a systems walkthrough of one transaction, but not much more. And the other thing is, if we are doing control testing on documents that a computer produced, well, the computer does it the same way every time, as long as there haven't been system changes. So if one comes out right, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 are all going to come out right too. So there's really not much point in doing more than one. Now, some of the negative conclusions: even if the test fails, it can still be okay, so we've wasted our time. Things were fine, but we did testing that said that they weren't fine, and then we had to do something else, so that's a little negative. Often extending our testing to try to get a positive result is pointless. You do 20 and there's 2 wrong. You do 40, there's 4 wrong. It's still too much. So that's the point: believe the result. If we do take a reasonable shot at trying to make our sample representative, and it comes up wrong, we should believe that our sample was representative. Number 6, control testing of details often fail even if there's no material misstatement, so why do them? The too much non-sampling risk, that's the research has found. And then initials may not mean much. We like to think that they do, and we're real happy when we find them there, but if they're not there, it may not mean much. Now, another observation: this was a client service sidelight. Found this about 4:30, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and the controller happened to wander by my desk to say, "How are things going?" And I happened to make an offhand comment: "Oh gee, we found that cash refund form sometimes isn't signed," and I said I would follow up more the following day. And the next morning I found on my desk a detailed report of an investigation he had done between like 5 and 7 at night into the issue, corrective action proposed, and stuff like that. So that's a good client. That's the kind of client you want. When they find something wrong and not being done the way they want it to be done, they respond quickly. So really, really good client. But lesson number 1, and I made a real point of this at that client after that: I never said anything about anything I thought might be wrong until I was very, very sure I was right, because I was sort of sitting there going, oh my goodness, I'm really glad I was right, because if I'd been wrong, I would have been in a meeting saying, how come you're saying our systems aren't good when they are good? So be very sure it's a problem before telling the client. Do the necessary work. And so you can also imagine next year I went, well, that's a stupid test and I'm not going to do it next year. I don't need to do it. I will take a look at that warehouse shortage report. I will assess risk of material misstatement, doing that as a risk assessment procedure. And I decided that I didn't need to do anything in the next year's audit. So as I'm sitting at my desk in the accounting area auditing away, the manager from that division comes by and says, well, when are you coming down to test the cash refund forms? And I almost said, I don't care about those forms anymore. And then I realized that he really did, and the controller really did, and to say that would be a really bad idea. So I said, well, we're coming down next Tuesday. And I realized that we had to at least pretend to test it, and we did it for client service, and we documented as such, so we didn't have to follow gas and have scope and anything like that. We were able to just go take a quick look through and see whether the forms were properly signed. And we noted that this was for client service in the file, and there wasn't a lot of time spent, but I guess if there had, I might have wanted to make sure the partner understood that I'd sort of been wasting some audit time just to make the client happy and make the client think we were doing a careful audit. So that was the second lesson. If there are things that your client really expects you to do as part of the audit, even though they're not, there was no need for this test anymore. You'd better make sure you do them. So, thanks for listening.